Today I'm speaking with Ralph Ellis. Ralph, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're good to be with you, Tim. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. I've been looking forward to speaking with you for a while. I'm glad it worked out. And just to give everyone a bio, if you don't know who Ralph is, Ralph Ellis is a researcher. He's been researching biblical and Egyptian history for more than 30 years. He's independent from theological and educational establishments, which allows him to tread where others do not tread, where others do not dare. And this independence has led Ralph to discover some very interesting biblical and historical truths that we're going to touch on today. One of those is the fact that the Israelites were originally Egyptians. The Hyksos shepherd pharaohs who were ejected from Egypt in the 17th century BC. And I'm sure we'll touch on that a little bit. And we're also going to go over the fact that Jesus comes from that heritage. And there's a whole story there. I won't hit give the punchline, but we're going to go into that a lot. In terms of your background, if I've got this correct, you started as a software engineer and then moved into mineral surveying, aviation, and paleoclimatology. That's a whole
Jack
list.
Of all trades.
That's amazing, and they're not easy. That's not like just you took a weekend class. Those are very high level areas. That's awesome. And just to finish up the bio, I was reading that you always maintained and build upon the archaeological interests and research of your father, which I wanted to ask about. And then as a historian, Ralph has toured the Mediterranean for more than 3 decades, searching for secular similarities and parallels between the apparently disparate disciplines of history and theology. The research has been fruitful, many discoveries being made, mostly in Egypt. And just to give his books as well, there's a Egyptian Exodus series, which includes Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs, Tempest and Exodus, Solomon, Pharaoh of Egypt, Eden in Egypt. There's also a King Jesus trilogy, actually 4 parts, Cleopatra to Christ, King Jesus, Jesus, King of Edessa, and the Grail Cipher. And then 2 other books here, Scota, the Egyptian Queen of the Scots, and Mary Magdalene, Princess of Orange. So that's a lot of work. Could you, after I've given a lot of that bio, could you tell us a little bit more about what I missed of all that, and then tell us anything of interest outside of your professional work that might be fun to share?
Yeah, just that this has been a lifelong sort of interest. I started this 40 years ago or more when at school. I was always sort of, I was the horrible little kid at the back of the class with his hand up saying, that doesn't make any sense, especially in history and religious education. I had a grounding in these subjects because of my father. He used to take us around to every single cathedral in the whole of Europe. Well, he tried to.
That's awesome.
But from a secular viewpoint, because he wasn't religious, he was more interested in the history and the architecture, a little bit like I am. And so it became a very early interest. And then, during education, the stories didn't add up, basically. So I was the kid at the back of the class with a hand up saying, well, sorry, that either that doesn't make sense, or when I got better at it, that's not actually what it says in the book. If you want to quote this book to me, let's get your quote correct.
Was that education in the UK?
Yeah, this was in the UK. So this was, I went to a C of E school, Church of England. And that's very laid back, of course, in terms of religion. They did a survey some years ago, which I thought was funny. And they asked priests in England if they believed in God, and 40% of C of E priests did not believe in God. Because the question was framed in a certain context. They said, do you believe in a God that can interfere in the, petty affairs of man and all that sort of, and of course, 40% of CAV priests said, no, that's not the sort of God I believe in. So it was fairly relaxed. You could discuss things within the CAV, within my school education. I didn't really go to Sunday school very often. I sort of got thrown out of Sunday school for asking too many questions. And I wrote the first chapter in one of my books when I was 14.
Really?
Because I was just trying to jot it down, basically, what my thoughts were on this particular subject. And of course, that wasn't printed until much later. The first book came out in 1997, I think, which was Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs.
Hmm.
And this was just a synthesis of everything I had learned up until that time, because I'd held these beliefs for a long, long time. But of course, how could I, just a sort of, not a professional in the field, just an amateur, be so bold as to put all of these thoughts down onto paper? Because surely someone's going to shoot it down, because I don't know enough. So I sort of tested this with a few articles and so on, and no one was sort of able to shoot down any of my observations and questions. And so I sort of got my courage together, and I printed a book and I think it was 97, which was Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs. And that was an overview of the whole of the Bible, from Old Testament all the way through to New Testament, going through some of the things I'd seen, some of the errors that I'd seen in traditional academic books, and some of the links I had made with classical history, because religious education, the Bible, it has a problem, and that is none of these people, none of these events, nothing within the Old and New Testaments can be found in the historical record. And that's a problem. And as I've said on several occasions previously, you've only got two choices really. Either this is all fabricated, it's mythological, or perhaps we're looking in the wrong region or the wrong era for these events and these particular characters.
And not to get ahead of ourselves, but you bring in the astrotheology part too sometimes, don't you? Where it's
yes,
not even...
that sort of came later. I found the people and the personages first before I found actually what they were talking about, because I didn't know too much about the astrotheology when I first started this, but it became a big aspect of what I discovered later. Because once you can put these people back into their true historical context, then you can find out what they were talking about.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, everything sort of makes much more sense when you do so, than the sort of fairy story, the story for children that is normally given. Because you get a lot of these parables in the New Testament and stories in the Old Testament, which really don't make any sense at all until you know the context of what they were talking about. And a lot of that context was astrotheology.
I think one of the biggest... I'm sorry, I was going to say one of the biggest ones about that I thought stood out to me a lot was the whole Elisha and the two bears and the 42 children. Once I realized what was going on there, I mean, it changes some of the awfulness of it. Like when you think this is an awful story, that's a good reason to reject the Bible. When you realize that they're not actually telling the story you thought they were telling, it doesn't make it...
little things like Snow White and the seven dwarfs. Snow White is the moon followed by the seven planets going around the ecliptic. And then as she approaches the sun, the wicked queen puts a corset on her and draws it tighter, so she gets thinner and thinner and thinner as the moon gets thinner and thinner as she approaches the sun. And then they have an eclipse, they have a kiss, and of course she comes back to life again. She comes back as the new moon. It's a story of the heavens again, but unless you know that, it's just a story for children.
Yeah, fascinating.
But yeah, this astrotheology has been encoded in many different fashions.
Yeah. Before we get into some of the meat of your books, could I ask, do you have any kind of interesting hobbies or any things that you like to do besides all these things when you're not working on your research?
Not really. I do a bit of flying occasionally, private flying, which is always fun. But mostly I would engage myself in research, which I find very rewarding. It's good fun. So just traveling around Europe, looking at all of these locations, you can't really study a subject until you've actually been there and actually studied it in situ, because A, it makes much more sense once you've been there and had a look around, and B, you stumble across things all over the place that sort of add to the story that you didn't even know about. It's very difficult sometimes to do this research remotely. You
Yeah.
really have to be there and have a look at the topic, for real.
Yeah, I'm very jealous. I've seen you've done a lot of traveling over the years. I definitely am jealous of how
Yes.
much you've done. You've been in, especially the parts that relate to this research. I mean, all over Egypt and the Middle East is just that's so cool.
Yeah, it's been difficult to get there. I try to stay safe, but I did manage to get to Syria on 3 occasions. Luckily, before it blew up again in 2011, there was a sort of interlude, when it was a little bit quiet in 2008. So I went there on 3 occasions between there and 2009.
That's awesome.
And that was very fascinating because, these were places that are off the tourist map. And I always think that's the best way to go. So when I went there, there was probably only about 20 or 30 tourists in the whole of the country, And so we had our little tour bus and we went around, and then I went again the second time on my own and just hitched across the country and so on.
That's awesome.
And down to Lebanon and places like that. So yeah, it's good fun.
Yeah, I remember in Bible college when I was a Christian, they used to talk about how they really wish that they could almost make it a requirement for the college students there to not be able to graduate until they had gone to the Holy Land. And I never got to go there myself, but definitely would love to travel some more when, especially when COVID dies down and as money allows.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that particular trip is not so rewarding because that's just it's a big tourist trap, so you don't really get to see some of the interesting stuff.
Yeah,
but luckily, Syria and Eastern Turkey, very much off the tourist map, and so a lot of the artifacts are, I wouldn't say pristine, but they just left there without any tourism, which was made it much more interesting, much easier to research.
Yeah, I don't want to belabor that point too much, but I'll just add my heart broke, as I'm sure the world did, when that whole ISIS and Palmyra thing happened.
Oh yeah, when they blew up Palmyra. Yeah, I was lucky. I got to Palmyra before it was blown up, so I'm one of the last people to have seen it.
That's awesome.
Yeah, before the temple was blown up. Absolute catastrophe.
Yeah, terrible. Well, before we get into some of the meatier parts of your research, I did just want to ask to go over your background a little bit. Did you grow up in a Christian family, or I know you mentioned your father wasn't really religious, but was anyone else in your family interested in trying to bring you up as a Christian, or at least a nominal Christian?
Yeah, it's interesting that I got interested into this subject so much. We've got no history of religion within our family at all, really. We're just standard C of E. I mean, a C of E person, what do? They do births, marriages, and deaths, and that's the only time they go to church, pretty much. Although I went to C of E school, and therefore we did all of the standard services at the local church. So we would go for Easter and Christmas and special occasions, but we didn't go there every week. And our headmaster was the vicar of the local church. So I had that introduction from him, and I have to say he didn't sort of endear me to the church at all. He was one of these bombastic fire and brimstone preachers.
Wow.
Shouting and spitting, and he was known as Gilbert Gobby, or Gobby Gilbert. That's right, because he used to, when he was speaking, he was so ferocious that there was gallons of spittle flying everywhere. He was one of those sort of preachers.
So he really believed it.
Yeah. However, looking at what he was saying, I didn't agree with what he was saying. Obviously, you couldn't sort of disagree in that sort of situation. But I could see immediately that what he was saying was not based in fact. It was not based in history. Even at that time, this was junior school, so I would have been, between, 10 and 11 or something. And that irked me somewhat. I've always been a sort of a bit of a truth seeker. If I see someone that's telling a blatant lie, I will sort of contend it. I won't just let them keep on spouting the same old rubbish. And I felt a sort of inward duty in order to do the same here. Here were these people standing up in positions of power and spouting what I considered to be a load of nonsense, even
Yeah.
at that early age, because, well, these texts are available, you can look it up. And what they were saying didn't really make sense anyway. And so there was an incentive there to go out and find what it really meant. And I suppose actually more than that, the real incentive was I declared myself to be an atheist at that time. So, age 9 or 10 or whatever. Actually, probably from the age of 7, I decided that I was an atheist. And
Can I ask, did you get
of
any,
course, in a sea of
did you get any
Sorry?
pushback from anybody? Did anybody try to say, no, no, no,
Well,
no, no?
that was the problem. Not exactly pushback, but people would say, why? You're going to a C of E school. None of the school children took this very seriously, so they just went along with what people had told them. Of course, they weren't doing any research on into this, so that they would say, "Well, why are you? Why are you different? Why are you not believing in this God?"
Mm.
And I have to say, I couldn't really give an answer. And so I had to go and look at the text to find out why I didn't, because they wanted an explanation. I had to give it an explanation, and that took research. So even in that early era, I was having to do research just to give an answer as to what I actually believed in. And then I found out very, very quickly that having done this research, I knew more than the people who were asking me. So people who were professed Christians who were now asking me these questions, and I was able to reply, and they hadn't a clue what I was talking about because they'd never read the text. And I find that's very common of most Christians, but I found it even common of people who should know better, academics, pious Christians who ought to know better, don't know the subject of their texts. And soon I was able to outwit people on almost all occasions because I understood the text very well.
I think about
And
that a
at the
lot.
same time, I was beginning to be able to put those texts back into the historical record because I saw some glaring similarities that were so obvious. I was wondering, why on earth can nobody else see these similarities? I mean, they're just so obvious. And it had to come down. I didn't understand it at that point, but it has to come down to the old Masonic adage, which is there are none so blind as those who will not see. Not cannot see, but will not see. So they're not physically blind, but they're only blind because they don't want to see what the texts are actually telling them. And that was interesting. And that was the beginning of the real research that ended up as the first book.
I think about that dynamic a lot because there's also the kind of a side dynamic of the people that do want to research it, at least in theory, want to. There's a lot of lack of information, a sheltering, if you will. I mean, I went to all the Christian stuff. I was on the other end of the spectrum from your upbringing. It was neck deep in Christianity, memorized thousands and thousands of verses, literally read the scripture front to back many times, copied it, made my own physical copy of it, went to Bible college to be a pastor, endless theology classes and all that, the Greek, the Hebrew, endless sermons that I would listen to voluntarily, endless books. And in all that, massive knowledge, almost everything that people like yourself and other mythicists and just people trying to put together the pieces, they didn't talk about it. I mean, like, they didn't talk about, for example, what the Essenes have to do with any of this. They didn't talk about how the book of Enoch is quoted dozens of times in the New Testament. And it's like, it's not necessarily that all that information would take every person out of Christianity, but just the idea of like, let's put all the information out as to how this shaped, let's talk about church history, not just the cleaned up parts that we want to, but all the church history, all the different, 40, 50 gospels that were out there, the 6 different books of Acts. Let's bring it all on the table and then let people decide. But it was like this party line was established and there was just crickets. Nothing else was allowed to be brought in.
They don't want to talk about anything that's controversial. They have a historical structure, because I found the same problem within academia as well as within theologians, because I've discussed this with theologians as well. Theologians have a religious structure that they have to conform to, because that's the only game in town. That's what they've got to sell, and so they have to stick to that structure. But I then found that academics have their own academic structures, which they have to keep to as well. Otherwise, they will have difficulty with their peers. They'll be called radicals or whatever, and they might, even have problems with their academic institutions. So they have these big, rigid structures as well. And so they won't talk about the controversial bits. And I'll give you one example because it's pertinent to what we're going to talk to in a minute. This is one of the things that I first discovered. So this was back in the early 90s and set me on this road to writing this book, Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs, was the similarities between the biblical Exodus and the Hyksos Exodus, the Exodus of the Hyksos pharaohs out of Egypt. Leaving that to one side for a minute, recently, a couple of years ago, I wanted to seal that within Wikipedia because Wikipedia is really slow on putting any of this stuff up. And so I put it into Wikipedia. And all I wanted to do, because I know they're very difficult, Wikipedia. If you put something in that doesn't have a reference, it'll be gone immediately. They just delete it. So I put in a reference from Josephus Flavius, who is Judaism's greatest historian, from circa 1st century AD. And he said that the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt were our people. They were the Jews. They were the Israelites. That's prima facie evidence that there is a link between these two peoples and these two exoduses, and we'll go through that perhaps in a minute. So I put that into Wiki, deleted, put it back into Wiki, deleted. And this big discussion goes on. But I don't know if people put things on Wiki, but there is a talk page as well as an actual page. And if you're a contributor, you go through the talk page and people say, why they've deleted this bit. And this discussion, I won't bore people with, the problems we had, but this discussion went on for 3 months and 36 pages of discussion, why they would not allow this piece of information. And the end result was they said, Josephus is unreliable. You can't use him as a reference. Well, sorry, for the 1st century AD, he is the only reference there is. And if you go through Wiki and looked at the number of references from Josephus Flavius, you would probably find that there are hundreds of thousands of references to him within the pages of Wiki. But anyway, they deleted it and they banned me from Wiki, so I got thrown off. So that information is still not there. So if you wanted to look up the similarities between the Hyksos and the Israelites, you still won't have that information because it's not in academic books, it's not in popular books, and it's not on Wiki. And the only place you'll find that information is in my books. And yet the links between the two are so obvious, it is unbelievable. But the censorship is still there. Even in the 21st century, you're not allowed to know that information.
You're mentioning the word censorship leads me to kind of maybe an intro to some of the issues in your book, in that the idea that if we know, and we know that censorship occurs today in many ways, there is a party line, there is such a thing as manipulation and just ways that people want to control the narrative. And if we assume that has always occurred, and there's a lot of evidence that it has occurred, we know that people have always burned books, people have always fought and shut the other party down. If we assume that, and we look at the evidence for where we know it did happen for sure, that we can tell where they tried to shut it down, but there's traces left behind, such as the Essenes and so forth. When you go back into history, you begin to see that even with our limited, view of what would have happened, in various situations, as we try to put pieces together, we begin to be more skeptical. And it's almost like, it feels like when I look at work like yours and some other people's, it's like you almost have to have like a prolegomena, like just to say, all right, before you dive into these books, you have in your mind, especially as former Christians, or as Christians, if they're watching or reading your books, they're saying, all right, this, Greek mythology, Zeus is mythology, Noah is, historical, or if you're maybe a liberal Christian, it's a parable. But most of the Jesus story, at least, walking on the water, the feeding of the 5,000, that's all like history from the Gospels. And it's almost like you have to you have to add a new bucket that you've never had before, and say there's a whole different way to interpret history that you've never really been taught, you've never really thought through. And I was wondering if you could kind of walk us through some of the things that for someone that would look at this stuff and say, I can't even, like, I don't even have a place to hang this. Like, how do you prepare people to think through these issues before you even kind of lay it on them as to what's happening?
Well, I'm not sure how it was from your sort of education, but from the C of E type education, all of this was semi-mythical anyway.
Okay.
Because the priests realized that you could not connect this with real history. Okay, it was something to do with Egypt, but we don't know who Moses was. We don't know Adam and Eve, or even Joseph, or even King Solomon and King David. We don't really know who they are. There's something to do with Egypt and something to do with the Near East, but we can't really put them back into the historical record. So it's all semi-mythological, really. And that's how it was taught. It wasn't taught as being real, not in the C of E church anyway.
Did you get exposed to the American, at least I'm not sure there's people in Europe that think this too, but the American more literal fundamentalist perspective on it? Did it seem silly to you? Or?
Yeah, but that gives Americans a problem, because they'll say it's real, it's history. And then you'll say, okay, where is it? Well, it's there somewhere. Well, show me. We've got a lot of this history. We know the history of Egypt. We know the history of the Near East from Josephus Flavius. Show me where they are. Well, yes, but you see, this book, and then we come back in this big circular argument because they can't show you any history whatsoever. And they basically have to say, well, here's the Bible, read the Bible. There's your history. Yeah, but where's that history in real recorded history? And of course they can't do it. And the reason they can't do it is because they themselves don't want to do it. And I'm pretty convinced of this. That wasn't my view when I first started this, but I've become absolutely convinced that the connections are so obvious to anyone with a lateral mind and a sort of secular independent way of thinking, that you could not miss this. This has been seen within history by many people before I have written about it. But they won't tell you about it, and they didn't write about it because it conflicts too much with the story that they have been given. So little things like the fact that Josephus Flavius said that the Israelites were the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. Okay, it's only like 2 lines within the works of Josephus, but it completely changes the whole of the Old Testament. So like Wikipedia, who refused to have that within Wiki, how can you agree to that? How can you use that as a basis of your research when it conflicts so much with the story that you've been told and you want to, to preserve and tell to others?
Yeah.
It changes everything. 2 lines of text changes everything. Suddenly the Israelites become pharaohs of Egypt. Hold on a minute. That, suddenly the whole story goes out of the window. They weren't slaves in Egypt. They were in Egypt, but they were controlling Egypt. These were the controlling pharaohs who were controlling northern and trying to control southern Egypt, because Egypt was divided at the time. But the interesting thing is the story remains exactly the same. So what I've done through these works, and we'll go through some of these proofs in a minute, but what this work does is it demonstrates that the Bible is a true historical document. Almost 100% all the way through. Well, I wouldn't say 100%. Let's call it 80% all the way through. Is a true historical document, which they should be cheering, to the heavens. Look, we've proved it's historical. It really exists. But unfortunately, the story that really exists is not the story they've been teaching. It's slightly changed. Same story, but now they are leaders and pharaohs. They are not slaves in Egypt. But the story actually makes a lot more sense when you put it together like that than it ever did when, we were talking about this fairy story. I call it real history covered in fairy dust, because they didn't want you to know the real history. So they just covered it in fairy dust and made this sort of semi-mythological sort of interpretation.
Yeah. Can I ask
you the underlying story is historical.
Can I ask you to go over one more thing, and then maybe feel free to dive right into your books, into kind of what you found. But one of the things I find so helpful about what you do in your books and your videos is you bring out the idea that in order for us to truly interpret history correctly, we need to be open to a couple pretty basic concepts. They're not that hard to understand, but one of them, for example, is that names get changed. A name might be one thing, and then someone takes it and changes the name a little bit, and it's the same person. You kind of, if you're not used to that, it's not hard to understand, obviously, but if you're not used to it, you just have to be like, oh, okay, so that's a dynamic that may have occurred. Another one, for example, would be the whole, when did this occur? Someone might say it occurred here, but it actually might have occurred here, and there's a reason for it. And to say, okay, I thought all this was, 0 AD was exactly when Christ was born, 33 AD or whatever was when he died, and that there's time and date issues you have to think about, name issues. And I guess maybe just again, before you maybe go into your books, is there anything else with that kind of line of thought that you've discovered that if you don't kind of mentally shift gears, it's going to be a stumbling block to get through it?
Well, yes, what people have to realize when they look into this is that a lot of this has been changed deliberately because people didn't want you to know who these people were. And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but with the Jesus character, he's been portrayed as a peacenik, a pauper prince of peace, wearing sandals and preaching peace. Well, what if he wasn't that character? So the character exists. He's a real character. He was a king of the Jews, just as it says in the New Testament. But what is he if he wasn't that pauper prince of peace that everyone is preaching about? Well, perhaps then you might have to change his name a little bit in order to divorce him from the real person, because you don't know what you don't want people to know who he really was in the historical record, because that will give the game away. And so they will change the name, just as Saul changed his name to Paul. We know this happens. A lot of these characters did. There were two languages involved. So Peter was Cephas, same name, different language. Thomas was Didymus, same name, different language. And then there was Pesher that came into it as well. Pesher is this Jewish prophecy from the Talmud. And within the Talmud, they had to cover up names because a lot of the Talmud was written in the Roman era, and they didn't want the Romans to know what they were talking about. So they would use Pesher. Pesher was used as prophecy. So you trawl through the Old Testament looking for something that's similar to what is happening now. So during the first century, you would be looking maybe for a revolution that happened in the Old Testament somewhere. And if you can make a comparison with the Old Testament, you can use the events from the Old Testament to prophesy what will happen in the future, in the current era. It's a bit like modern law in Britain. A lot of it is historical law. So you might not have a law in the current era. So you'll go into the past and look for a precedent in the past, and you'll use that precedent to tell you what you should do in the current, the current events. And Pesha is very much the same. But within Pesha, you can also use that to cover up what you're talking about. So if you don't want to mention the name Jesus, you can call that person Elijah or something of that nature. And you can talk, for pages and pages about Elisha, and nobody will know you're talking about Jesus. And they do that all the time in the Talmud. They call him Ben Stada. They call him Kamsa, Bar Kamsa. They're all sort of pseudonyms. And what's the other one? Pantera. They're all pseudonyms for Jesus and his father. And there's one for Mary Magdalene as well.
They do a little sleight of hand with the numbers too, right? The gematria, and they kind of
there's that as well.
Coding.
There's that as well. So you can use these devices to cover up who you're talking about, because as far as the Jews were concerned in the 1st century, after the fall of Jerusalem, they could not talk about certain events because Rome banned it. Rome didn't want, and this is a lot of the reason for why the New Testament was written in the fashion it was. Rome didn't want you talking about revolutionaries in Judea after the Jewish revolt. And so by all means, if you wanted to tell that story, you had to do it slightly in code. And that's exactly what they did. And that's why you get these different names that appear all over the place. And so, for the Jesus character, I've probably got about 10 different names for the Jesus character, but that's not surprising. I seem to remember going through my King James Bible, and at the beginning of the New Testament, it had the 70 names of Jesus. And it went through all of the different names of Jesus that you will find within the New Testament. Simple things like, whether you might call him the Son of God, the Son of Light, the Word, all of these sort of things, which are, you don't think of them as names, but they are obviously, used to denote Jesus. And it went through this great list of pseudonyms that they have for Jesus. So yeah, there are lots of names.
I love it.
Most of them are obvious, and I don't use any pseudonyms or hyperchorisms that do not have a way of referencing them.
Yeah.
So I have to have at least 3, perhaps 4 different ways of referencing that same person before you can declare, yeah, that's what they were talking about. They were talking about Jesus here.
Yeah.
And the famous one, we'll come on to that later, is Bar Kamsa, who probably nobody knows about. But Bar Kamsa was a pseudonym for Jesus, and it's pretty obvious that it was.
Yeah.
But we'll go through that later.
Well, I love, just to wrap up maybe this intro part of it, I love that you're helping people not just get into some details. This means this, and this was probably associated with that, but you're helping people to kind of, to borrow a biblical phrase, to take the scales off of your eyes and say, there is more going on here. And you can, with a little bit of a primer, you can actually interpret and decipher what's going on here. With, you do have to actually do your homework. But if you were a Christian, you would do that anyway. You'd go through your Bible dictionary and your Strong's Concordance, and you would read your theological books to figure out what you think according to the Christian party line, what it means. Yes. And it's like you have to do a little digging on this side too. But it's like, I love that you help you. You're not just doing the research, you're helping us change our mindset about how do you do it, how do you think through this, and how do you honestly unlearn some of what you've learned, kind of clear
you have to do it with an open mind. That's the problem. Anyone can read these texts, anyone can research these texts, but you have to do it with an open mind, because otherwise you will stumble at the first hurdle. You will get no further than the first hurdle, because the story is not the story you want to hear. And I'll give you one little example. Is Joseph going back down into Egypt. And you'll probably know this story very well. You can probably tell it much better than I can. And he says to his brothers, because he's bringing his brothers down into Egypt, and he says to his brothers, we are going to meet Pharaoh, but whatever you do, Don't tell Pharaoh that we are shepherds. Tell him that we are bull breeders from our youth until now. Otherwise, we will not be able to be allowed to stay in the lands of Egypt. You know the story very well. But what does it mean? Was there any prohibition against eating sheep or shepherds within Egypt? So what's it talking about? There was no prohibition against sheep. So why have they got to pretend that they are cattle breeders? Makes absolutely no sense in terms of agriculture. So what are they talking about? Well, unless you know about astrotheology, you'll have no idea what they're talking about. And they're talking about the processional change between Taurus and Aries, which happened in 1750 BC. This is the precession of the equinox. I'm not sure if your listeners will be familiar with that.
Somewhat, but yeah, you feel free to give a little background.
This is worth going through just in a couple of minutes, because it's central to all of these discussions about the Old and New Testament. The Earth wobbles on its axis, and as it wobbles, it points at different stars in the north. This is a 26,000 year wobble. I mean, it's a big wobble, this one. But it has the effect of also changing the constellation that rises at the vernal equinox, March the 21st, each year. And so you will have a different rising constellation every 2,240 years, roughly. And these were called the great years. Sorry, correction. These were called the great months. And so you have a normal month, and you have this great month, which lasts 2,200 years. And this is a real astronomical event. You can go and check it on any sort of astrolabe or whatever. And you can use this effect for denoting the sort of eras for any events or any monarchs or so on. You can associate them with Taurus, with Aries, with Pisces, whatever. And so you know what era they're talking about. Well, it happened that in 1750 BC, Taurus changed to Aries, from bulls into sheep. And this was central to the Hyksos, because the Hyksos were known as the shepherd kings. This is why the patriarchs were all called shepherds, because they identified themselves with the great month of Aries. And that's why Joseph was talking about bulls and sheep when he was talking about Pharaoh. He was saying to his brothers, don't tell Pharaoh that you are a shepherd king, a Hyksos, because they'd been expelled from Egypt. We'll go through this in a minute. They were coming back into Egypt. Don't tell Pharaoh that you were previously Hyksos shepherd kings who followed the constellation of Aries, because you will not be allowed to stay in the lands of Egypt. Say instead that you are Apis bull worshippers. Otherwise, you'll get thrown out of Egypt. And suddenly, that little conversation with Pharaoh makes sense, because, of course, the Egyptians hated shepherds because they just have a civil war with the shepherd kings and chuck them out of Egypt. We'll go through this in a minute. And so, yes, of course, it all makes perfect, absolute sense, but only if you understand that they were talking about two powerful factions within Egypt, the Theban kings and the shepherd kings. And that puts a different spin on the entire Old Testament, because now it means that these people, Joseph and his brothers, were powerful people, that Joseph himself must have been a prince of his people coming back into Egypt. And I have to concur with Ahmed Osman, who writes some very good books on this subject, where he identified Joseph as being Yuya. And Yuya was the patriarch, the father of the Amarna dynasty. And we'll go through that later. But yes, suddenly we can see some historical truth sort of showing through here within the Old Testament record, and more than that, and I find this fascinating in some respects, is that here in that little thing we've been discussing, we probably have a verbatim account of a discussion between Joseph and Pharaoh that has come down through 3,300, about 3,300 years. And we have a verbatim account of what was said in the royal court. And it's come down to us as the story of Joseph.
Yeah, you just need a primer.
Because before it didn't make any sense. So you could say, okay, this discussion with Pharaoh just doesn't make any sense. So it's mythological, But now it makes perfect sense. And so we can actually sort of flag that as being a real verbatim discussion between these two people.
Yeah, and all you needed was a primer to decipher it.
All you needed to know is what they were talking about.
Yeah, and it's
fascinating.
And
they don't want you to know what they were talking about because A, it means that Judaism was based on astrology, which it was, and I'll prove that later.
Yeah.
And B, it means that the Israelites were powerful people.
Yeah. I was just going to add and have you take us right into the depths of it, but it really carries through to even the Gospels, where even right up to the end of Mark, I believe he says, I'm with you till the end of the age. I mean, it's translated, mistranslated
the ages, yes,
world sometimes, but it's not world, it's ages. And Jesus is he's the Pisces age, and
he was the change. He was the first of the fisher kings. He was the first of the kings of the new great month of Pisces, identified with the fish.
Yeah, 100+ years will be in Aquarius. So
it's 2,350, I believe, when we enter Aquarius. So we've got a little while to go.
Yeah, I won't live to see that. Well, I know we've talked around a lot of your research, but if you want to take us in now, share kind of the highlights and some of the details of what you've learned.
It depends where you want to dig, whether you prefer Old or New Testament. Perhaps we should start with the Hyksos, since we've talked about the Hyksos.
Sure, yeah.
And then we can sort of go wherever you like after that. This was probably the first thing within the Old Testament that I actually saw. So I had been delving around the New Testament for a while, and then I decided to have a look at the Old Testament. And this stood out to me as being absolutely obvious, that we have the Exodus, which is the big event in the Old Testament, and it does not exist in the historical record. And again, we have this old problem. The characters and the events don't exist in the historical record, therefore it is mythical. And you'll see a lot of people even today saying the whole thing is mythical, is fiction, because we cannot find any of these events in the historical record. And even recognized archaeologists like Finkelstein and Silverman will say that, and they're Jewish, of course, they work in Israel, and they'll say, sorry, this event did not happen as written, because we cannot find any evidence for it in the historical record, which is perfectly true. If you look in the 1300s BC, you won't find any information on it at all, because you're looking in the wrong era. We come back to this old conundrum. If you can't find it, either you're looking in the wrong location, or you're looking in the wrong era. If you go back to 1570 BC, you'll find the whole of the Exodus just sitting there. So in 1570 BC, we had another Exodus. This is the Exodus of the Hyksos people, the shepherd kings we were just talking about. And so these were the events of the Hyksos Exodus. And remember, this comes from history. This is nothing to do with the biblical text. So we had these two peoples in Egypt. Egypt was divided, and there was a civil war between the north and the south. And the northerners in Lower Egypt were called the shepherd kings, the Hyksos. So these people were known as shepherds. They wore earrings and curly side locks of hair. One of their kings was called Jacob. They were involved in a war with the Theban Egyptians. As I was saying, there was a civil war going on at the time. There were storms and darkness for 3 days. There was a great ash fall, and some 500,000 of these people were kicked out of Egypt, and they went from Pyramisi and they went to Jerusalem. And en route, they destroyed Jericho. Now, does that sound similar?
Just a little bit.
To a well-known event from the biblical texts. I mean, for instance, things like, you know, the ashfall. There was an ashfall at this time. We know there was because there's archaeological evidence for it. This was in the time of Ahmose I. So we're talking about 1570 BC here, the very start of the 18th dynasty. And there was an ashfall then. We'll go through that in a minute. But in the biblical text, it says, so God says to Moses, take you handfuls of ash from the hearth of the fire and cast it up into the heavens, and it will fall as small dust over the entire land of Egypt. You could not get a better description of the long-range fallout from a volcano if you tried. It's a perfect description of a volcanic eruption. And of course, when we look back to the Hyksos Exodus, there was indeed a big volcanic eruption, the biggest in recorded history, which was the eruption of Santorini, Thera, in the Mediterranean. And so in about 1600 BC, Thera, I'll call it Santorini because most people know it as Santorini. Santorini blew its top. And as I say, it was the biggest eruption in recorded history. And it covered Egypt with an ashfall, a light ashfall. And it would have caused darkness for 3 days. It would have caused storms. It would have caused a pillar of fire and a pillar of smoke. And it would have caused a tsunami. The waters being parted. The waters that caught the Egyptian army. And so here we have what you might call a black swan, I suppose. In fact, yeah. 3 black swans. A black swan being an event that's so unusual that no one could predict it would happen. But if you have 3 of them all together, it must be evidence of an eyewitness event, because here we have, well, more than 3. We have a pillar of fire and a pillar of smoke. We have an ashfall. We have darkness for 3 days. And we have a tsunami, the waters parting, allowing the Israelites to cross over the Reed Sea. And then the waters coming back in again, as we know they do with the tsunami, and sweeping the Egyptian army away. So we've got 5 black swans there, all in the same story. And so this has to be an eyewitness event. Sorry, an eyewitness account of an event that happened. And we know that event happened. It happened in about 1600 BC when the island of Thera blew up in the Mediterranean. And it would indeed have caused a large tsunami. So the story is correct. The whole of the Exodus story is correct. But it means that the Israelites, again, were the Hyksos, because this was the Exodus event that affected the Hyksos. And the Hyksos people, the shepherd pharaohs, were kicked out of Egypt and they went to Jerusalem. And if you look at the archaeology for Jericho, Jericho was destroyed in about 1570 BC by the Hyksos. And so now we have that matches in as well, because everyone has always said, well, you know, there's no evidence, you know, that the Israelites destroyed Jericho, you know, because it had been abandoned for, 250 years before they ever got there. 300 years. So that didn't happen. So therefore, the Exodus event is all mythological. It's all fictional. But hold on, if we put this event 300 years back into the past, it was the Hyksos who destroyed Jericho.
Hmm.
And therefore it matches up with all of the events of the Exodus. But it does mean that the Israelites were the Hyksos.
Hmm.
But then, of course, if you go into the works of Josephus Flavius says that the Hyksos were our people. He specifically links the Hyksos with the Israelites.
So based on that, do you think that most Jewish people at that time knew that as kind of common information?
Yes, they were. Josephus certainly knew about it. So I think most Jewish people would have.
Hmm.
But I think after the Babylonian exile, there was a move against telling the truth in this respect, because well, if you read the rest of the sort of Tanakh, the evil Egyptians, are a big theme within the Tanakh, and so they didn't want to be associated with the evil Egyptians. They didn't want to be known as being polytheist, which of course the Hyksos were polytheists, and to sell a story of persecution is a very valuable political ploy. If you want to keep your people together, you will say you're oppressed. Oh, it was those evil Egyptians, it was those evil whatever they were from other places. It's we were the oppressed people, and you've got to stay together as a people, because that's what God wants, etc. It's a perfect way of keeping a group of people together, by just sort of portraying yourself as a persecuted people. Islam does the same today. Whatever happens around the world, Islam will say, oh, it's because we're oppressed. It's nothing to do with us. I know we blew up those people over there, but we did it because we were oppressed. It's a very valuable political ploy, and that's what they've chosen to do. So it was much easier to sell this story of oppression, that we were just, we were at the mercy of these terrible Egyptians. We couldn't control the situation.
Hmm.
Selling the story, the real story, that you were the Hyksos, the most powerful people in the world, with the most powerful army in the world, and yet you were still defeated by the Theban Egyptians, that's a very difficult sell. How are you going to keep the people together with that story? It doesn't work so well. And so it was much easier to sell this semi-fictional story than it was to sell the real story. And that's what's come down to us. That probably wasn't even the story in the sort of 6th century, because if you read the works of Josephus, Josephus writes a complete Old Testament. So he has a secular version of the Old Testament, which he took from the Tanakh that was in the temple when it was destroyed in AD 70.
Hmm.
So his Tanakh is much older than any of the Tanakhs that are extant today. And his version of it is, it's a secular version, it's not a spiritual version. It gives the game away much more than the present Tanakh. And you can see within his story that the Israelites were much more powerful. On quite a few occasions, he gives the game away that they were actually powerful people in Egypt and not just at the mercy of the Egyptians.
Can I throw in a quick question? As you're going through all that, one of the questions that pops into my mind, and if you haven't really dove into that, that's fine if the answer is no, but have you done any research onto the origin of the Yahweh name and character, and how they kind of switched, and how maybe how it relates to El and Asherah and all that?
El and Elohim. Yeah, it's interesting. I had a look at the word Yahweh, and it seems to, within Egyptian, because here's another big thing that they won't admit to, is the Israelites spoke Egyptian. So the Tanakh was written in Egyptian. It wasn't written in Aramaic. Or rather it was, because Aramaic is a daughter language of Egyptian. It's the same language. So if you can speak Aramaic, you can speak Egyptian, or even Hebrew, come to that, I suppose. It's just Egyptian with a different accent. There are many, many similarities. I wrote a dictionary of Egyptian words that have been transferred into Hebrew. And so within Egyptian, Yahweh seems to refer to the moon god. And the moon god in Egyptian was called Yah. And from that, you get many derivatives, and one of them is Yahweh. So I think they were referring to the moon. So you've got the sun and the moon. El is the sun god, and Yah is the moon god. And that would have been standard within all of these early religions, that you worship the sun and the moon. And we see this in later Judaism as well, in the Temple of Palmyra and many other places. But then there's another god. Well, two other gods, actually. The god is called Shaddai as well. And he is the god of storms and so on. And I link him back to Seth, actually, because Seth again was the god of storms and so on, and warfare. And then the other name for the Judaic god is the Aten. And of course, the Aten comes from the god of Akhenaten. His god was called the Aten, or the Adon. And the Jewish god, or the Israelite god, is called the Adon on about 20 occasions within the Old Testament, within Genesis. And so they've picked up this old name of, because Pharaoh Akhenaten was something to do with this. We'll go through this perhaps in a minute. But Pharaoh Akhenaten was the first monotheist, just as the Israelites were the first monotheists. And his god name was the Aten. And the Israelite god was the Aten.
Does that have to do with the Garden of Eden, or am I mixing words up?
Yes, because if you look into the first verses within Genesis, it says that a river flowed out of the garden, and from thence it was parted into 4 branches, or 4 heads, as it says in the King James version. There is only one river that passes through a garden and is then split into 4 branches, and that is the Nile. So we must be talking about the Nile here. And of course, within Egypt, they had a Garden of Aten. The Garden of Aten was, well, it was the sort of ribbon oasis of the whole of the Nile Delta, was the Garden of the Aten. But within the palace of Pharaoh Akhenaten, he had a Garden of the Aten, because the gods liked their gardens. And so every pharaoh would normally have a garden somewhere. Well, they certainly did up in Avaris, in Pyramisi. They had a garden to the god with trees planted in it. And these walled gardens were known in the East, they were known as a paradise, from which we get the word paradise. And so this garden in Amarna was called the Garden to the Aten. It was the Garden of Aten. And of course, we tend to say this, we pronounce this with an A, but in some respects, I think that's wrong, because the Aten was spelt with a reed glyph, and the reed glyph is more of an E than an A. And so really it was the Garden of Eden. And so that was the Garden of Aten, the Garden of Eden.
I gotta say, just as you're saying these things, that's the kind of stuff that I think should be like 101 when they do these kind of classes. Teach people the whole story, give them the full information, and let them make what they want. But I mean, to deprive people of that information, which is pretty basic, it almost seems like a travesty to me.
Well, it goes even further than that, because of course, Adam and Eve were naked within the Garden of Aten. But if you look at the images of the Pharaoh, Akhenaten and Nefertiti were always portrayed as being naked in the Garden of Aten. The two lovebirds of the Garden of Eden were Pharaoh Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti. And they were the first monotheists. And of course, they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. That was their history. They were kicked out because he ran a very unpopular regime, and he was finally thrown out of his Garden of Eden. And he had to go out in the big wide world, and he was forced to put clothes on.
That's amazing.
And we don't know what happened to him because, archaeologists will say, oh, he died, in Amarna. There is no evidence that Akhenaten died in Amarna. He had a tomb, which he was making, but it was never finished. And so it was quite obvious that their regime was crumbling, and they were pushed out of Egypt on an exodus. And this is the little exodus. And we have this story from Manetho. So we have this in history as well. We don't just have this from the Bible. Manetho was an Egyptian historian, 3rd century BC. And he's quoted by Josephus. So again, we come back to Josephus as giving in this information. And Manetho said that there were 2 exoduses out of Egypt. There was the big exodus that we've already talked about, which was the exodus of the Hyksos Israelites out of Egypt. And there was a small exodus. And if you read it, it's quite obvious that the small exodus was the exodus of Pharaoh Akhenaten and Nefertiti when they were thrown out of Egypt. Because it says that this Pharaoh, and it's quite obvious that he's talking about Akhenaten, he was a heretic, and we know that Akhenaten was a heretic, and he was kicked out of his power base in the north. And so he set up a new city in the middle of Egypt on the east bank of the Nile, which they called the Quarry, on the east bank of the Nile. Well, that fits the history of Akhenaten perfectly, because he was kicked out by his father, and he set up a commune basically. And it was a commune. It was just like David Koresh, over in America. You'll know all about him, but it was just the same as that. And he started up his little commune on the east bank of the Nile. And of course, it would have been called the Quarry because there was nothing there. He had to make a city from nothing. So it's a sort of crescent of land on the east bank of the Nile would have resounded to the hammering of chisels on stone to try and make his palace, his temple, his city on the east bank of the Nile. And then, as he says, these people were kicked out. They were there for like 20 years or something, and they were kicked out of Amarna. And they went up to Pyramisi, which is Avaris. And again, that concurs with what we know about Amarna, because it was deserted after about 20 years. They were kicked out of Amarna. Now, as I say, archaeologists will say that Akhenaten died there, but Manetho suggests that they went on an exodus. They went up to Pyramisi, which was known as Avaris at the time. It wasn't known as Pyramisi at that time. And from there, they were probably kicked out of Egypt altogether, because we have an account from Scottish history and Irish history, which says that Ireland and Scotland were settled by a pharaoh from Egypt. And this is a very early history. It's from the 6th century in Ireland, and it's from the 14th century in Scotland, saying that this royal family from Egypt arrived in Ireland, and she was known as Queen Scota. And it's from Scota that the Scottish people were supposed to be named. So this is a very early history from these parts that says that an Egyptian queen, king and queen, came from Egypt. And of course, this again is branded as being complete fiction. Of course, it's mythological. But reading through it, I mean, it's fairly detailed. It's not just a broad brush sort of history of the Scots. It's fairly detailed. And it gives the king lists of Egypt. Now, the king list within Scotti Chronicon, which is the Chronicle of the Scots, comes from Manetho, this Egyptian historian we were talking about. And it's a history by Manetho that identifies Pharaoh Akhenaten as being the pharaoh that was kicked out of Egypt. No, correction to that. It identifies Akhenaten, and the pharaoh that actually sailed to Scotland was Pharaoh I, who was possibly the father of Tutankhamun. So the reigns in Egypt went from Akhenaten to there was another minor pharaoh, then Tutankhamun, and then Pharaoh I. And Pharaoh I was a very important person within the regime. He took the throne when Tutankhamun died. I think that he was actually the father of Tutankhamun, because we don't necessarily know who the father of Tutankhamun was. But the regime was crumbling at that time. And so Pharaoh I was finally kicked out of Egypt. Again, we don't know where he went to. People will say he died in Egypt, but there is no evidence for his death in Egypt. But Scotti Chronicon appears to show that he went on an exile, a forced exile. So he didn't just flee. And I think this is the same with Akhenaten when he was pushed out of Middle Egypt. They didn't just flee. I mean, these people were sons of God. You don't just kill these people. You know, it's very difficult. They were asked politely to depart and go somewhere else. And so it says that he set up a fleet of, if I remember correctly, something like 50 ships. So they had this grand fleet of ships, and they were told to go. So they loaded up with all of the supplies they required, and they sailed off into the western horizon. And that was the end of Pharaoh I. But Irish and Scottish history seem to suggest that they actually ended up in Ireland and Scotland and were the foundations for the Irish and Scottish peoples.
I'm just curious, as you're going through fascinating stuff that, you know, maybe it's been out there for a while. It's new to me. Do you know how, you know, Egyptian and Jewish historians, what they do with this information currently? Have you had any interactions with?
They bury it.
Okay.
It doesn't fit with the story they're giving, the religious structures that they work within, the stories that they have told their followers. It conflicts wildly with what they are teaching, and so they can't entertain this too much. I've had discussions with them, and they've been very hospitable, I have to say, but you've got to be quite broad-minded to accept this.
Yeah.
As being the truth. I had a discussion with a rabbi in London who was very interested in it, but as far as I know, he's done nothing with it. I had a discussion with a few C of E priests who were again very interested, saying, yes, well, that sort of makes sense, and it puts it back into the historical record. But of course, they didn't really run with it because it conflicts too much with what they're actually preaching. And historians likewise. They, as I said before, they teach within very restrained structures, and so they can't go too far outside those either. And they regard me as heretical as well, because it's outside their field, and they don't want to be seen as being idiots either. You can imagine a professor who's been teaching this for like 30, 40 years. And then someone comes along and says, well, actually, everything you've been teaching for 40 years is a load of rubbish. Well, how are you going to accept that very easily? You're not going to accept it. And so it's regarded as heretical, but it makes a lot of sense of everything we know about the Old Testament.
Yeah, I think it's
and I
great,
do the same to the New Testament as well.
It's a great point to say there is, like, so much of what we've been taught, there's a different side to it, and there is such like that it's like a life lesson almost, like that dynamic of saying there is a different piece. There's a lot of different pieces to these puzzles that we've been told, and there's people that just won't even go down those paths. Like I was just speaking the other day with Bill Darlison, who wrote the gospel and the Zodiac and the Gospel, and talking about how he has done a lot of research on how the Zodiac is all through the Gospel of Mark, and he's shocked at how he'll look at very high level commentaries by major theologians on the book of Mark, and they won't even mention it. It's like it's not even there to them. It's like completely invisible.
And it's obvious that it was there, because if you go to, and this is one of the central things I have in my New Testament work as well, is that the central symbol of Nazarene Judaism was the zodiac.
Yeah.
And we know this because if you go to the Sea of Galilee and you go just 4 kilometers, no, it's actually 4 furlongs south of the gate from Tiberias, you will come to Hamat Tavira, which is a synagogue on the Sea of Galilee. They say it's 4th century, but it's actually 1st century. And on the floor, it has a huge great zodiac. And all of the early synagogues in this region have a zodiac on the floor. So for these Nazarene Jews, and obviously Jesus was a Nazarene, the central symbol of their religion was the zodiac. And this zodiac is a wonderful zodiac. I mean, it's exactly the same as we will have today, except it's obviously in Aramaic, it's in Hebrew. The language of Galilee tended to be Aramaic rather than Hebrew. And it was obviously the central component of their religion was the zodiac. And more than that, the person who owned this zodiac was Jesus. And then we come into this conundrum of who is this Jesus character? Because again, we have this terrible position where all of these famous characters and events are missing from the historical record. So the most famous people of the last 2,000 years, Jesus and Saul, are both missing from the historical record. Who are they? Where are they? How can we lose 2 extremely famous people? And the only way they can get round this is by saying, oh, well, he was a pauper carpenter. Nobody knows about pauper carpenters. No, he was born as the king of the Jews and he died as the king of the Jews, for God's sakes. He was a king.
Yep.
He would not have had the power that he had within Judea if he wasn't a king. And so we have another conundrum there, because if you want to see this as historical instead of being mythological, how on earth can you have a king that has gone missing from the historical record? Because we have the whole history of the 1st century Judea, courtesy of Josephus Flavius. He knew everybody. He knew every pauper, every pimp, he knew every princess, everybody in Judea he wrote about. So how could a prince or a king go missing within Judea in the 1st century? Simply not possible. Well, actually, it is possible, because there's been a bit of a cover-up. In fact, there's been a cover-up of gigantuan proportions.
Can I just interject it? That what you're talking about is so amazing to me, because when you look at all the other historians, like a lot of historians that easily would have talked about Jesus if he was, the literal character that we see in the
Yes.
Gospels, they would have easily talked about him. And even the Gospels themselves say he did so many things that all the books in the whole world couldn't contain what he did. If he's turning the whole world upside down, somebody would have noticed. That's a problem.
Somebody would have noticed.
Yeah, it's just, anyway, continue.
And well, I mean, the obvious thing that we would have noticed if we had actually sort of, taken note of what was said is he describes the Jewish revolt in the little Apocalypse. You will probably know it very well. I prophesy, I predict. Well, he wasn't. He was actually watching it. that this temple will be destroyed, the walls will be torn down, not one stone will be left upon another. He again said that Jerusalem would be surrounded by a wall and a trench during this same little apocalypse. Okay, when was Jerusalem surrounded by a wall and a trench? It's the Jewish revolt. The Romans built a wall and a trench around the whole of Jerusalem in AD 70, well, 68 to 69, during the Jewish revolt. So it's talking about the Jewish revolt. This is why, and they won't tell you why, if you say, to any theologian, well, when were these Gospels written? Because this was the AD 30s. When were they written? Well, there was a period of, oral transmission, and they weren't written until about just after AD 70. Why do they say that? They won't tell you why they say that. They say that because all of the events in the Gospels come from the Jewish revolt. Loads of them were taken from the books of Josephus Flavius. Most of Luke comes out of Josephus Flavius. The description of the siege of Jerusalem with the wall and trench around Jerusalem and all of the stones not being one left upon the other, it all comes from the Jewish revolt. And they know this. And so they can't say that these Gospels were written before AD 70 because they carry so much AD 70s material. And there's more than that. For instance, Jesus laments, and again they circumnavigate, Jesus laments the death of Zacharias Barachias. And this is actually Jesus himself lamenting his death in the middle of the temple. But we know who this guy was. He was Zacharias Barachias, who died between the temple and the altar in the AD 60s, not in the AD 30s. And so they know all of this. Jesus mocks, in fact, I'm not even sure if they know about this one. Jesus himself mocks Ben-Zizit Hakeseth. You probably won't know this because it's not explained explicitly in the Gospels, but where he's mocking someone for their big tassels and their big cushions, if you remember that particular verses. That comes from the Talmud, and that is a mockery of Ben-Zizit Hakeseth in exactly the same verses, exactly the same. The trouble is that Ben-Zizit Hakeseth was one of the leaders of the Jewish revolt in the AD 60s.
So this whole thing is leaning towards being,
what,
30 years off?
40 years.
40 years off.
It's the 40-year chronological chasm. And this runs all the way through the New Testament. And the best one I like, which I didn't find until later, which is why I like what the theories that I put forward. So I put this theory forward of the chronological chasm in 1997 in Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs. It wasn't until much later, only about 5-6 years ago, when I wrote the Grail Cipher, that I went through Arthurian legend. And Arthurian legend has the same problem, because it says that Joseph of Arimathea was a soldier working for Emperor Vespasian. Well, now there's a problem, because Emperor Vespasian didn't become emperor until AD 70. So Arthurian legend has a bit of a problem here. So what does it do? It says that Joseph of Arimathea took Jesus down from the cross, and then he was imprisoned by the Romans, and he went to sleep for 3 days and woke up 40 years later. And he was still the same age. But here he was in the AD 70s, and now he could be a soldier working for Emperor Vespasian. this 40-year chronological chasm invades all of history, because anything that mentions the gospel events has to be in the AD 30s. But it wasn't. It was in the AD 70s. And that's why Einhorn, I forget her first name now. There's a
Lena?
researcher over in Sweden called Einhorn.
Lena?
And Lena, yes, right, Lena Einhorn. And she's taken some of this material and shows it graphically. And she came up with this lovely graph of all of the events and characters from the biblical record, and then all of the events, the equivalent events and characters from Josephus Flavius. And she ends up with this graph with two peaks on it. And there's a peak in the AD 30s, the gospel material, and a peak in the AD 60s from all of the Josephus material, which is identical to the biblical record. And so it's quite obvious that the gospel events are actually talking about the AD 60s. Now, I didn't come across it from this point of view. I came across this in the early 90s when I was doing my research then, by looking at the character Saul, St. Paul, because he's missing from the historical record again. And if you're going to find out anything about the Jesus character and the gospel record, the main character you need to actually discover and find is Saul. And he's missing from the historical record. So who is Saul? How did he go missing? Why don't we know who this character is? How is it that we don't know who he is? I mean, this is the guy who wrote the Gospels, pretty much. I mean, he wrote all of the epistles are written by Saul, pretty much.
Yeah.
Most of the Gospels have sort of inputs from Saul, especially in my point of view, especially in Luke. How does such an influential person go missing from the historical record? Well, he didn't. He's there. But the problem is you cannot admit who he is. And so by all means, you would have to cover this comparison up. So I just went through looking at comparisons between people. And there is a person who's very like Saul in the historical record. And I came out with some like 20 points of coincidence. But the best amongst them were, they were both on a prison ship going to Rome in AD 62 that was shipwrecked on Malta, the great shipwreck story within the Gospels,
Acts.
which is a great story because...
In Acts, right?
It's in Acts, yeah. It's a great story because it's a first-hand eyewitness record of what happened. You could not tell that story if it hadn't happened to you. There's too much detail in the story that you would not know about if that hadn't happened to you. So we have this great storm. They're sailing on this ship, and they changed ships in Cyprus, I believe they were. And it even names the ship. The ship was called Castor and Pollux. So the ship has a name, and they're off on this ship with these prisoners going to Rome, and they get caught up in this huge, great storm. And it's got all of the events of, what happened in this storm. And, eventually they lighten the boat by throwing stuff overboard. The priests on board, there were prisoners going to Rome. They wouldn't eat. And so Saul has to tell them to, actually, this comes from the works of Josephus. But anyway, they're told not to be kosher and they've got to eat. And then the sailors, they hear the roar of breakers. And so they know they're approaching land. And so, before that, they'd thrown the lifeboat overboard. Or they allowed it to trail the boat. So even in this early era, they carried a lifeboat on board their ship, which was too heavy. So they threw it overboard and trailed it behind on a rope. And then they heard the sound of the breakers. So they lowered the anchors over the front of the ship to hold the ship before it went onto the rocks. I mean, this is all very much eyewitness events. And then anyway, so they get shipwrecked on Malta, then they get taken to Naples, and then they both go and see Nero. So this happens to both people. So this happens to Saul and this other person. And then what else happens? They are both writers who write a load of books, and they send letters all over Europe. They both have the same scribe and translator, who's called Epaphroditus, and they were both chasing a rebel around Galilee called Jesus. You remember it says in Acts of the Apostles, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? They were both, chasing this guy called Jesus across Galilee. So who is this alter ego of the Saul character? And the answer is a very unpalatable Josephus Flavius. And that's just impossible for any Christian to understand that Saul was Josephus Flavius.
Answers so many questions.
It's a whole basket of questions comes out of that. But because Josephus is such a horrible character, I call him the Quicksilver Quilled Quisling, because he's just sort of awful character. And it means that Jesus had to be alive in the AD 60s, because Josephus wasn't born until AD 37. So none of this could have happened in the AD 30s as it's given. It had to happen in the AD 60s. But it explains so much. I mean, for instance, Saul was going around Galilee, persecuting and imprisoning the proto-Christians, the Nazarene Church of Jesus and James. How was he doing that? Who gave him the authority?
Gamaliel, right?
Yeah. How did Saul have the authority to go and arrest Christians and put them in prison? Who gave him that authority? Where does it say what authority he had to go and imprison Christians in Galilee? And this would have been in the AD 60s.
I'm trying to remember what it says.
It doesn't.
Okay.
The problem is he didn't have jurisdiction there. He was not an army commander. He was not a policeman. He had no authority to actually arrest these proto-Christians. But as Josephus Flavius, he did, because Josephus Flavius was the army commander in command of Galilee, and that was his job. And what he says he was doing in the AD 60s, the late AD 60s, is he was going around Galilee as the chief army commander in that region, trying to arrest Jesus of Gamala. And okay, so now we have a similar event. And all you need to do in order to make the one the same as the other is to allow yourself to agree that Jesus of Gamala was the biblical Jesus. That's not difficult to do. The only trouble is that these events took place in the AD 60s. They didn't take place in the AD 30s. So you've got to understand that Jesus was alive and well, and something to do with the Jewish revolt in the AD 60s, because Jesus of Gamala was the leader of the Jewish revolt.
So does that mean that Josephus, if he's Paul, that he did then, I guess, become a believer? Would you agree with that conclusion? No,
because they wouldn't accept him. I mean, this is a bit like the Pauline story where they didn't trust him.
I mean, when Paul's in the epistles, preaches the clear gospel that Jesus is, from God, and he's here to bring us salvation. Are you saying Josephus wrote those books? But Saul was not a member of the Church of Jesus and James. Remember, right. He was the enemy of Jesus and James. Right. They were very much enemies. He wanted to be the apostle to the Gentiles. So Saul went to James and said, look, I've been on this, evangelical tour across
across the Mediterranean, and the Jews really didn't want to know, but the Gentiles were quite interested. So can I go and preach to the Gentiles? And James said, yeah, okay, Sonny, because he was only quite young at the time. And he said, okay, well, here's the 4 rules of simple Judaism, I call it. And I forget what they are now, but anyway, it was do not eat strangled animals, do not drink blood, do not get involved in fornication, and something else. And that was it. I mean, so he had resolved the whole of Mosaic law down into 4 rules for simple Judaism. And so Saul went off around the Mediterranean preaching to the Gentiles. And his
But that was
church grew.
Josephus?
Sorry?
But that, when you say Saul, are you saying that was Josephus?
Yes. Now, that is the problem, because people, when I said this back in 97, people said, oh, well, you can't be right, because Saul was born in AD 10 or AD 20. And Josephus wasn't born until AD 37. It's much too late. Can't be the same person. So the question then is, where does it say when Saul was born? Where does it say how old he was? Doesn't say at all. So many people understand the information they have gathered during their education, which is not actually there in the texts. Nowhere does it say how old Saul was. And then they say, well, it's just not possible. He was going on his evangelical tours in the early AD 50s. So it's not possible. Well, yeah, of course it's possible. Because Saul would have had his bar mitzvah in AD 51. And so he would have been a man in AD 51. So when he went on his first evangelical tour, which I say was in AD 52, he was a man. Okay, he was only 15, but he was still a man. And I have to say to people, you know, if you're sitting at home and there's a knock on the door and there is a couple of Mormons sitting there, especially here in Europe, do you get a couple of old geezers on your doorstep? No, you don't. You get an older guy who's about 20 and you get a young guy who's about 16. That's what you get. That's what evangelicals are. They're always the youngsters. Before you've settled down and had your kids and, you know, become established, you go off on your missionary tours. And that's what you get. You get a couple of teenagers arrive on your doorstep. And that's exactly what Saul was doing back in the AD 50s. And so, yeah, the age does match up. He could easily have been, Saul could easily have been Josephus and been 15 years old on his first tour. And yeah, it's likely that on that first tour that they didn't get a good response from the Jews. And so he went off and he became the apostle to the Gentiles. And
can I just interject? That means that he was, if he wrote the epistles, at least the ones that, you know, the scholars agree are legitimately Pauline, then if he wrote these, which clearly describe a Christocentric salvation message where this is all through Jesus Christ, no matter whether you think Jesus was a mythological angel from heaven or if he was a guy, whoever Jesus was, he was the path to salvation according to Paul. So does that mean then, you know, connecting the dots, Josephus was in fact a believer in salvation through Jesus as the Messiah?
Yes, but under his own terms. So he wasn't preaching Nazarene Judaism.
Right.
Nazarene Judaism was all about the zodiac.
Right.
And the Old Testament. And of course, he threw all of that out of the window and said, all you need is salvation.
Right. Just grace and faith. And
so the whole of Mosaic law disappeared. And he was preaching a completely different church to the Church of Jesus and James. And they thought nothing of this until he started becoming very powerful. And so he started gathering more members and more supporters than the Church of Jesus and James ever did. Church of Jesus and James was Jewish and would only preach to the Jews. And so they had a limited audience that they could, change to their brand of Judaism. I mean, their brand of Judaism was quite different from Orthodox Judaism, of course. So they were preaching a messianic form of Judaism based, I call it Egypto-Judaism, because there were lots of Egyptian elements still left in it. Remember, that's where they came from. That's where their ancestry and their religion originated. And I say that's what, why they were still venerating the zodiac. It was leftovers from when they were in Egypt. But Saul's church was completely different. It was a Gentile church, a Rome-friendly church. It became so because, the Romans saw that this was just absolutely perfect for them. And so he was preaching about this new king of the Jews. But of course, Jesus was the king of the Jews, but a real king, not just some sort of fictional spiritual king. He was a real king of the Jews. And we come back to this problem of how can you lose a real king within Judea in the first century? Well, I mean, it's very easy. I mean, for instance, do your listeners know that in the AD 50s, Judea had a queen? The queen of Judea in the AD 50s was Queen Helena. And you won't find her even now. If you look around Jerusalem, there's no statue to Queen Helena, even though she saved Judea from starvation in AD 47. There is no statue to Queen Helena. And yet she had the biggest palace in Jerusalem and the biggest tomb in Jerusalem. And she was the one who furnished the Temple of Jerusalem and bought the solid gold menorah for the Temple of Jerusalem. It was all done by Queen Helena. But even if you go there now, they're digging up her palace just at the bottom of the Temple Mount at present. But if you go to the excavations, it doesn't say Palace of Queen Helena. It says the something like the Gorian car park is what it says. So you've got no reference that this was the palace of the most powerful queen in the whole of the Near East in the AD 50s. She's been deleted from history. You don't know about her. So yeah, it is possible that you can hide a first century king that's not being mentioned. Well, she is mentioned, but you've really got to dig deep to go and find her. So who was this Jesus character? Well, we've seen already who he is. He's this Jesus of Gamala character. Although that doesn't tell you what king he is yet. But we know that Jesus of Gamala was something to do with the biblical story, because if you look into the Talmud mentions Jesus of Gamala, the same as Josephus does. And interestingly, the Talmud says that Jesus of Gamala was the leader of the Jewish revolt, as does Josephus. But the Talmud also tells us that Jesus of Gamala married Mary Magdalene. Now there's a problem for you. What it says is that Jesus of Gamala married Mary Bothus. But myself and Professor Robert Eisenman, if you read his James, the Brother of Jesus, I think it was his big seminal book, he went through the whole of the Talmud in these aspects, and he drew the same conclusions with much more detail than I did when I did it, that Mary Bothus is Mary Magdalene. Because there were two sisters. There was Mary and Martha Bothus, and there was Mary and Martha, who were the Bethany sisters.
Can I just stop you? Say, if you're someone who's never heard this stuff, it's kind of like it's getting your mind blown a little bit. It's you have to sit back and
it's changing the story somewhat, but it's interesting because
it makes so much sense.
Yeah, Mary and Martha, the famous sisters at the house in Bethany. The house in Bethany was owned by Simon. It was the house of Simon, yes. Now, in the Talmud, Mary and Martha Boethus were the daughters of Simon. That was their father. So all of this sort of, I mean, it's not just, I'm making a comparison with a name. Oh, I think that person is that person. No, this is multiple links all pointing into the same result. Most of these links have 5 or 6 different proofs coming from different directions to say this person is that person in the historical record. And anyway, the Talmud says that Mary Boethus married Jesus of Gamala. And Mary Boethus, because they make a play on her name, where they call her in Aramaic, they call her the dresser of ladies' hair. And in Aramaic, it sounds like Mary Magdalene the Nazarene, if you pronounce it in Aramaic. And so there's this wonderful play on words that tells you that Mary Boethus was Mary Magdalene. And she married Jesus of Gamala. And there's a problem here. A, this marriage happened in the AD 60s. Okay, so that's a problem for starters. B, Mary Magdalene was the richest woman in the Near East. When she married Jesus of Gamala, she was given a dowry of 1 million gold denarii. And that's a problem because now she's no longer the person that you think she was. How much was that worth? Well, in modern, if you just translate it into the gold price today, it was about $280 million was her dowry. Wow. But the gold price has dropped since the 1st century. And so what I did in order to calculate this properly was I looked at the wage rates for soldiers in the 1st century. And I'm just going to look up this up because I've forgotten exactly how much it was. So if you calculate it looking at the wage rate for a centurion in the 1st century as against to an army commander, a similar army commander today, her dowry was worth $20 billion. She was rich. She was super rich. And this agrees, of course, with, if you look at things like the medieval Golden Legend, which is a story about Mary Magdalene, even in the Golden Legend, it says she was a princess that owned 2 castles in Judea. This has been long known about in certain circles, but of course not to the general laity within the Catholic Church. The Golden Legend would have been a sort of Crusader Templar text and not something that the Catholic Church would have approved of. But it says that she was rich, and the Talmud says the exact same, that she was very rich. In fact, so rich that she bought the high priesthood for her husband so he could become the high priest of Jerusalem. And she did so by paying them off with a takub of silver, which is, I approximate to something like 70 kilos of silver, so that he could become the high priest. And of course, if you look at Hebrews 7, it clearly says that Jesus became the high priest of Jerusalem. And that would have been in the early AD 60s, something of that nature. So you can see how the story is the same, but has changed. So we're talking about important people again, just as we were with the Old Testament story and the Exodus. Suddenly we're talking about kings and queens. And we're talking about the AD 60s, and we're talking about the Jewish revolt, but the story remains exactly the same. So again, I can go to, the C of E priest and say, I found your Jesus. I know exactly who he is in the historical record. And they will have to deny it. Even though I've got the evidence that they were looking for the last 1,000 years or more, they will have to deny it because the Jesus I have found is not the Jesus that they have been preaching from the pulpit for the last 2,000 years.
Mm.
So that's a problem for them. And so they have to turn a blind eye and say, well, no, it can't be, it's too radical. Sorry, can't be the same person. But it is the same person because it explains the inexplicable. All of those strange stories that happened in the New Testament that don't make a lot of sense suddenly make sense in this new context.
Mm.
For instance, turning water into wine. It's a miracle. It's a miracle. No, it's science. It's not a miracle. And it's a science that is perfectly aligned with this new interpretation of the gospel story. In the first century, there was a famous scientist known as Hieron, some people say, of Alexandria. And he was like the Leonardo da Vinci of the first century. This is a guy that was making water pumps. He was making steam engines. He was making mechanical birds that could whistle and automatic doors and all of this sort of stuff, all being made in the first century. In Alexandria, in Egypt, of course, which is where Jesus went for his education, remember? Mm-hmm. He was in Egypt for his education. Anyway, one of the best tricks, because he liked doing tricks to amaze the aristocracy. It's probably where he made his money. And one of the famous tricks that he liked to do was turning water into wine. And we have 3 of his trick jugs. And we have the original drawings from from Hieron of Alexandria showing how to make these trick jugs to turn water into wine. And they were made very skillfully with siphonic action, differential air pressure, and water tension. And using those, you could put your thumb over a hole in the top of the jug. So the jug has a handle. You can put your finger over a hole. And depending on whether you have your thumb on there or whether you take your thumb off, you can pour water or wine.
That's awesome.
Now, that has been known. I mean, this has been known about for hundreds of years. We've got the Greek texts. He explains how to make it and how it works, and he's got a cross section so you can see all the compartments inside the jug. We've known about this for hundreds of years, and yet nobody equates that with Jesus turning water into wine at Cana. How's that possible? How can people look at that? And it's not as if I'm the first person who's seen the Mechanics, I think it's called, of Hieron of Alexandria. I'm not the first person to have read this book, for goodness sake. Thousands and thousands of people have read this book, and nobody has equated that with Jesus turning water into wine. Why is that? It's theological blindness. It's academic blindness, because the theologians won't tell you, and the academics, even the sort of semi-secular or fully atheist academics, will not tell you either. Why is that? Why won't they tell you that this was a well-known party trick in the first century? Well, they won't tell you because it spoils the story a bit. Okay, the miracle is no longer a miracle, it's just pure science. But also, why would a carpenter have a trick jug from Hieron of Alexandria? I mean, these things were stupendously expensive. You didn't get these, in the local bazaar down in Galilee. These things would have been hugely expensive, just as, set-piece party tricks even today are hugely expensive. If you have, what's that famous magician, David Copperfield or something, he will only perform to an audience of, 10,000 people. Suddenly this guy is no longer a pauper carpenter. He has to be something to do with the aristocracy. He has to be connected with Egypt somehow. Hieron came from Egypt. who would have these sort of party tricks in the first century? The aristocrats, the kings, and the princes in this region. And that's why they won't tell you.
It's almost like a willful ignorance at that point, because there's so many pieces to this that fit. And I know you're just scratching the surface, but even what you've gone over so far, there's so many pieces that fit. At a certain point, it goes back to your quote. It's not what you don't know, it's what you won't know.
Yes, it's what you won't know.
Yeah.
You close your mind to it because it's too troublesome. We can't have all of our beliefs and ideas overturned.
Yeah,
so we close an eye.
Especially when it has the implication of the deity that we were raised with, that we believe is answering our prayers, is listening to us, is watching us.
And it takes the role of God out of it as well, of course. So if you're a deep theist, that's a problem, because you don't need you don't need a God for any of these stories anymore. It's very much a secular story.
Yes.
Okay, it doesn't exclude God, but it certainly diminishes the role of God.
Yeah.
So that's a problem if you're a theist.
It certainly changes your Bible into a very different kind of book than you thought it was.
Into a history book, which is what it is, and it's and the problem is it's a very accurate history book, all the way from Genesis all the way through to Revelations. It's a very accurate history book, but only if you read it as such, and only if you will allow it to take you where it wants to take you. And that's the problem. So I suppose we ought to find out who this Jesus character was then, shouldn't we?
Yeah.
Now, this was a difficult story. All of this has evolved. So there is no plan to my books. I didn't even know who these characters were when I started it. So my book on Jesus, if you look at it in my computer, is called Queen Helena, because that was the title of the book. Because I'd never even heard of Edessa when I started writing this book. But the research pointed in that direction, and the book changed tack completely, and it became a completely different book. So we have this idea of Jesus being this guy called Jesus of Gamala, and he appears in the works of Josephus. But he's another chimera. We can't place this guy in the historical record. He's just not there, apart from, the mentions in the Talmud and the mentions in the works of Josephus. There is no archaeological evidence or evidence from any other works that I know of that will place Jesus of Gamala into the historical record. So the problem is, who is this guy? Who was he? Well, the main thing we know is he was a leader of the Jewish revolt, the leader of the Jewish revolt. So we know who he should be. How to find him? This took a lot of... It came from a very different source. So I didn't find him straight away. I was reading a manuscript someone had written on Queen Thea Musa Urania, who I'd never heard of, and I think most of your listeners will never have heard of. So we go back here to Roman history. So we're talking about the reign of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. So Julius Caesar was killed in, let me think about this, 43 BC, Ides of March. And Cleopatra was in Rome at the time. And she flees straight back to, because her life's in danger, of course, she flees back to Egypt. And Cicero says, well, I can't quote it exactly, but anyway, he's worried because Cleopatra is pregnant. And he says that we don't want a scion of Caesar, a son of Caesar, from an Egyptian queen to become the next emperor of Rome. Well, they didn't have emperors at that time, but anyway. But suddenly, a few months later, the crisis is over, and nobody is worried about this scion of Caesar anymore. So what happened? Well, we don't have much information about this particular offspring of Cleopatra, but if the danger was over, it was quite probable that this was a daughter, not a son. And this daughter goes missing from history, so we don't know a great deal about her. But 20 years later, so Caesar is now dead. The emperor is now Augustus, Octavian Augustus, and he's sorting out his borders. And so he gives to the king of Mauritania, which is sort of like northern Africa, who's called Yuba II. He gives him a diplomatic bride, which is the daughter of Cleopatra, Cleopatra Selene. Again, a queen that people don't know very much about, but she's a real queen. She was a daughter of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, and she was given to this king as a diplomatic bride. And they have this enormous great tomb over in Libya. And then he goes to Parthia, because Rome had lots of problems with Parthia. They had lost 3 battles and about 5 legions fighting with Parthia, which is Persia, basically, in the east. And so he gives the king of Parthia, who's called Phraates IV, he gives him a prostitute or a concubine called Theomusa Orania. And that can't be right. You can't give a queen and a princess and a daughter of the gods to some little monarch over in North Africa, and then to the great king of Parthia, you give him a concubine called Theomusa Orania. And Phraates IV was so impressed with this gift, he made this lady the queen of all Parthia. So she became his chief queen. It's quite obvious that she was much more important than has been described. And for many reasons, I show that she was this lost daughter of Queen Cleopatra, who had been given as a diplomatic bride to the king of Parthia. And then we drift on to about 2 BC. So we're in the right area here. And this queen is thrown out of Parthia with her son. So her son is Phraates, or Phraates V, and she is now Queen Theomusa Orania. And everyone said, no, she's a mythical queen. She doesn't really exist. She only exists in this ribald story told by Josephus Flavius. But then they found all of her coins over in Persia, in Parthia. And so, yes, indeed, she is a real queen. And she was thrown out of Egypt, out of Persia in 4 AD. So here we have the nativity story. What is the nativity story? The nativity story is a story about a king. We've already said he's a king. He was said to be a king at his birth, who's on a journey somewhere without a palace, in a state of some poverty, on the road, and he's visited by the Persian Magi, the 3 kings. Why on earth would the Persian Magi be interested in a Jew over in Judea? Makes no sense. Why were the Persian Magi there? Well, this news story tells us the complete reason, because this was a royal family. We know they were royal. She was the queen of all of Parthia or Persia. She's on the move. She's just been kicked out the country, in a state of poverty, has no palace, probably has to go into some sort of stable because they have nowhere to live. There's a royal birth at this time, and it's visited by the Persian Magi. Why would the Persian Magi want to be there? Because he was a prince of Persia. He was a son of the previous king of all of Persia, Phraates IV. but he was now over in Syria, Judea. They had gone on an exodus. They'd gone on an exile because they'd been kicked out of the country. That explains why the three magi would want to come and see this particular royal birth. And that is the basis of this nativity story. And so what do they do in this region? Well, they set up a city-state, because having come out of Persia, initially I thought they were in a state of poverty, but they weren't. They had nowhere to live, of course, because they'd just been thrown out. However, it transpires that when they came out of Persia, they took half of the Persian treasury with them. So they weren't lacking in funds for making a city-state, which is exactly what they did. They set up their own city-state on the borders between Rome and Persia, which was the kingdom of Edessa. And Edessa nowadays, it's in sort of eastern Syria. So it's nowadays it strays up into Anatolia as well. So Edessa is Sanliurfa, if you want to look it up on a map. Sanliurfa, which is just in southeastern Turkey. And their kingdom stretched from Edessa to Amida, which was down on the Tigris. And then it was a sort of rectangle going all the way down to sort of Damascus. Looks very small on a map, but actually it's bigger than England. So it's actually quite a large, there weren't many towns in it because a lot of it is not terribly habitable. But it was quite a reasonable sort of kingdom they had. And it was on the buffers of Rome and Parthia. And we have this story again from Josephus Flavius, who calls these people the Babylonian Jews from beyond the Euphrates. And of course they were Babylonian Jews, because this is this Nazarene Egypto-Judaism, as I say. So they weren't Jews as you would understand them today, but Judaism was not as you would understand it today either. If you go into a synagogue today, you won't see a zodiac on the floor, that's for sure. But you do if you go into an ancient synagogue, you will see the zodiac. So these were what I call Egypto-Jews, Nazarene Jews. And we know these people became Nazarene Jews because the Talmud tells us. The Talmud tells us that the daughter of these monarchs, who was our famous Queen Helena, who became the Queen of Judea, became a Nazarene Jew. She spent 7 years initiation to become a Nazarene Jew. And so we have exactly what the gospel story starts with. A king, he would have been a son of the people who were on this exile. We have a prince or king who was a Nazarene Jew. Remember, Jesus was called a Nazarene. Nazareth did not exist in that era. There was no such town. He was called the Nazarene because he was one of the Nazarene sect, just as, was it Peter or was it Saul? Anyway, one of those two in the Gospels was said to be a Nazarene, and it was called the Nazarene cult in the Gospel accounts.
I believe it was Paul in Acts, if I'm not mistaken, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it was Paul, yeah. And he was called a troublesome fellow, one of those Nazarene cults. And so, yeah, and we know that these people who were called the Babylonian Jews, who had come to settle in eastern Syria, and they were specifically asked to come there. Now, this was down again to Octavian and to Herod, and this would have been one of the sons of Herod, because Herod the Great had died. So this would have been Archelaus, or forget what the other one was called. They were given this territory on the eastern borders of Judea and Syria to act as a buffer state between Parthia and Rome, to prevent all of the friction that they had had between Parthia and Rome. And they were specifically given this region tax-free from Roman taxes and from Persian taxes if they acted as a buffer state between these two major empires. And that's the role that they actually played for the next 300 years.
Mm.
But that was an important point. They were given this land tax-free. But later Roman emperors came along and tried to tax them. And that's why you have all these references, of course, in the Gospels to taxation events, with Matthew being a tax collector and, Jesus saying, render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, but render unto God what belongs to God. But he says, actually, render unto Thea what belongs to Thea. And of course, his mother was called Thea. That was her name. It's like when all of these things can be translated incorrectly if you don't know what they're talking about. When they say that the kingdom of God is nearby. Well, yes, it was. It was about 200 kilometers north, because Edessa was known. His formal name was the kingdom of heaven. That's what it was called, because his mother was called Urania, Queen Thea Musa Urania, and Urania means heaven, of course, in Greek. So it was known as the kingdom of Urania. It's still called that even today. And of course, the kingdom of Urania is the kingdom of heaven.
That's amazing.
So
yeah, it's like it's right there in front of you. You just don't know. It's like a code.
Yeah. It's a slight mistranslation, but it makes much more sense in a secular format than it does in a spiritual format. But of course, it's so easy just to turn that into a spiritual reference, the heavens above. So we have this family who are now ensconced in Edessa, which is, as I say, in northern Syria. And we have a dual story, and I'll have to go through this very quickly. We have a dual story from Josephus Flavius, who says that the leader of the Jewish, because you remember we were looking for the leader of the Jewish revolt. The leader of the Jewish revolt was a king from Adiabeni. But in all my research and all the research of everyone else I've looked at, nobody has found any archaeological evidence for Adiabeni whatsoever. It does not exist. However, when I went to look at the Syriac historians said that Queen Helena, this famous Queen Helena, she was from Adiabeni. But the Syriacs say that she married King Agbarus of Edessa. Again, all of these kings coming out, these monarchies that you've never heard of before. She was married to King Abgarus of Edessa, this new city-state that we were talking about in the kingdom of heaven. And his son, according to Josephus, was the leader of the Jewish revolt. And this is odd, because if you look up the Jewish revolt in any academic text, or if you look it up on Wiki or anything like that, it won't tell you who the leaders of the Jewish revolt really were. But Josephus does. And if you look it up, it says the leader of the Jewish revolt at the beginning of the revolt was the kings of Adiabeni Edessa, and the leader that was captured at the end of the Jewish revolt was the king of Adiabeni Edessa. And so now we have this link back to the Jewish revolt, back to the leader of the Jewish revolt, who, remember, was called Jesus of Gamala before, but now we have another name, and that was the sons of the king of Edessa. Actually, the king of Edessa had died by that time, so now the prince was now a king. And his name was King Hyksos, which is why I don't think that Jesus has anything to do with Joshua. They made that up later because they wanted it to be a Jewish Aramaic name. Right. But it wasn't. I believe that Jesus was actually derived from Hyksos, which was a Persian, Parthian name. Which is why if you go to Arabia now, the name of Jesus is Issa, which was derived from Hyksos, which was the name of this king of Edessa.
Can I ask a quick interjecting question? You mentioned Persia. The Persians would have been very, Zoroastrian, and I know that I've seen people point out there's some Zoroastrian concepts, but they're not as prevalent, of course, in the Old Testament, but they become very clear by the time you get to the New Testament. And do you think that that's related, or?
Yes, because all of these religions originally were very much the same. They were all to do with the heavens, the sun, the moon, and the zodiac. And so you will have similarities between all of these religions, but they've been covered up. They are within Islam, but heavily covered up. You would never know about it. But look at the symbol of Islam. It's the star of Venus and the moon, the crescent moon, is still the symbol of Islam. It's being totally covered up within Judaism, because you would never believe that the Jews venerated the zodiac. But if you go to ancient Judea, you will see all these zodiacs all over the place. And in fact, they've so divorced themselves from this religion, this ancient Judaism that they used to have, that there was a party just after I visited it. There was a party of zealots from Jerusalem went out to the Hamat Tavera zodiac and started hacking it up with pickaxes, because they said it had nothing to do with Judaism. But this is a synagogue. It's got the Temple of Jerusalem on the top of it, and the Ark of the Covenant, and the shofar, and all of the other symbols of Judaism. It is a Jewish synagogue with a zodiac on it. So a lot of these religions have covered it up. Christianity has covered it up. You'll never know that the zodiac is a central component of Christianity. We've divorced ourselves from the religions that used to be only 2,000 years ago.
I know this. I'm not the first. I was just going to interject. I'm not the first one to notice this, but for so many Christians that are opposed to the concept of evolution, the story that we're talking about has evolved so many ways. It's like a classic example of evolution.
Many fashions. Yes. But the interesting, to cut a long story short, and we could talk about this for hours. But the interesting thing about this king of Edessa is that he was the leader of the Jewish revolt. But we have a story, again from Josephus Flavius, about the end of the Jewish revolt. And the kings and the princes of Edessa were captured after the Jewish revolt, because it failed. The Romans won this particular war. And he was coming back from Tekoa, which is Herodium, which is just south of Jerusalem. He was now working for the Romans. Remember, he did the same thing as Saul did. He was a Jew, and then he changed side. He had a flash of inspiration on the road to Damascus, and he started working for the Romans, and he became a Roman army commander. This is Josephus Flavius. So he was now a Roman army commander coming back from Tekoa into Jerusalem, and he sees the three leaders of the Jewish revolt being crucified. And so he goes to the governor, who was Titus at the time, and he asks for them to be taken down early. So they're taken down early, they're giving medical attention, and two of them die, and one of them survives. Familiar story? This is from real history. This is not from the Gospels. And the interesting thing is that as a king of Edessa being crucified, he would have been wearing a purple cloak and a crown of thorns. Because the traditional crown of the Edessan kings was a crown of thorns. That's what they wore. All of the kings of Edessa wore a crown of thorns. And this is where the story came from. It's just not a crown of thorns as you would like to perceive it as a Christian, because it has to be it's a crown of brambles, or so a crown of hawthorn twigs and branches. No. It was a proper royal crown that had thorns on the top of it. It was a crown of thorns. And he would have been wearing a purple cloak, because the whole goal of this enterprise was a dispute with Rome. And we know that this was, dispute with Rome, because we have it from Mark. Was it Mark 15:7, where Jesus was imprisoned alongside revolutionaries who had committed murder in the revolution. What revolt was that in the AD 30s? There was no revolt in the AD 30s. So what was it talking about? It was talking about the Jewish revolt. This was 40 years later. This is the chronological chasm. And Jesus was the leader of the Jewish revolt. That's why he was jailed for being a revolutionary. And yeah, the leader of the Jewish revolt would have been wearing a purple cloak, because the whole idea of this revolt was to take over Rome. And we have two problems here. Is the biblical story won't tell you why Jesus was involved in a revolt. They steer really clear of that one. I mean, they don't want to mention that. And then historians will swing clear of telling you what the Jewish revolt was all about as well. Why was there a Jewish revolt? It's portrayed as being a sort of a little local problem in the eastern portions of the empire, you know. Those uppity Jews, you know, they were just fighting amongst each other, you know. There was nothing to do with that. It was a bid for the throne of Rome, because the throne of Rome was empty, and it was empty for whoever had the biggest treasury and the biggest army to go and take it. And they tried. It was the year of 4 emperors. There was 4 of them came and went. Well, 3 of them came and went, and 1 survived. But it was more than that. It was actually, and nobody will admit this, it was the year of 5 emperors. And the 5th contender for the throne of Rome was Jesus. This was the whole point of the Jewish revolt. This was the whole point of the gospel saga, is that he wanted to take over the throne of Rome, because the throne of Rome was empty. Nero had died in AD, died suicide, murder in AD 68. And he was actually killed by Epaphroditus, who appears to be the same guy who was the scribe working for Saul and Josephus. But that's another aside. The throne of Rome was empty for whoever could grab it. And all you needed was a strong army and a big treasury. And the kings of Edessa had both. They had an army. We know all about that from the works of Josephus and the works of the Syrian scribes and chroniclers. And he had a large treasury. And what you ended up with in Judea in AD 70 was a battle between the king of Edessa and Rome, Commander Vespasian. And this was not just a local problem, because whoever was going to win this battle in Judea was going to become the next emperor of Rome. And as it happens, of course, the Jesus character lost, and it was Vespasian who sailed back to Rome and became the next emperor. So this little battle, this little dispute that was going on in Judea was nothing to do with Judea. It was a battle for the throne of Rome. Whoever won that particular battle was going to become the next emperor.
Can I ask
so
then?
Jesus very nearly became Emperor Jesus of Rome, but he didn't. He was lost. And they covered up what had happened because the Flavians, the Emperor Vespasian, didn't want anyone to know what had happened in Judea. The last thing he wanted was anyone else starting another revolt in the eastern borders of the Roman Empire.
So do you think they had a hand in writing some of the
Very much so.
Gospels? Or okay.
Remember, the guy who wrote all of this was Josephus. And Josephus was the pet scribe and chronicler of Emperor Vespasian. It was Vespasian who paid for all of these books. So as the chief chronicler of the Romans in AD 70-71, Josephus Flavius, who is Saul, of course, which we've sort of demonstrated, he wrote the secular history of the first century in Judea, and then he wrote the spiritual history of Judea in the first century, which we call the Gospels.
Mm.
He either wrote it or he edited it, because there's so much Josephus material. Everyone has recognized there is so much Josephus material in the Gospels. And they say it was only written, after AD 70, because they know there's so much of that material in there. It's pretty obvious that his fingerprints are all over the Gospel sort of texts.
Mm.
And he was being paid by Rome.
That's amazing.
He was the Roman chronicler. And so Rome said, okay, you can write this story. In fact, we want you to write this story. But you've got to cover it in fairy dust, which they did. So you've got to divorce it from the true events. And they did that by slipping it back by 40 years. And suddenly you can't find it in the historical record because, they've relocated it into the AD 30s. So it's impossible to find. And B, you've got to make this guy pro-Roman.
Mm.
You can't say directly that this guy was fighting against Rome, that he was a rebel rebelling against Rome. So you've got to make him pro-Roman. And so Jesus says, turn the other cheek. Oh, that was brilliant, wasn't it? He says, in the epistles, he says, you must do as the emperor says. You'll know the passage probably better than I do. And then he says, render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. I mean, this guy was just perfect, wasn't he?
Hmm.
It was exactly what the Romans wanted, because they wanted to quell messianic Judaism that was disturbing the eastern borders of the Roman Empire. And more than that, what they created was a new, not entirely secular, but certainly a Gentile form of Judaism. So Rome was able to neuter not only Orthodox Judaism, but especially neuter Messianic Judaism by forming a new form of Rome-friendly Judaism, what I call simple Judaism, Judaism for Gentiles, the Church of Saul, which was nothing to do with the Church of Jesus. It was a Rome-friendly form of Judaism, which would counter and overlap and crush Messianic Judaism, which is what it did, because it had the backing of Rome. And people will say, no, the Christians were all oppressed. No, they weren't. The only people being oppressed were the Messianic Jews, the Church of Jesus and James. They were the ones being oppressed. Christians were not being oppressed in the AD 70s, 80s, even 90s. They had some oppression a bit later on, after the Flavians were deposed, but not during the Flavian era. They were not being oppressed at all.
It feels like
they were being used as a bastion of Rome against rebellious Jews.
Yeah, it feels like, just as kind of a, maybe to begin to wrap us up, one of the major takeaways I keep finding with, whether I'm talking to someone like yourself or just doing my own studying on my own, is that there is so much that we are not told about this story, and the whole, just swallow the party line, just take it as it is. This is, gospel truth, no pun intended. And it's like, there's so much more. And I'm aware that there's some people, maybe at Bible college or pastors, that they didn't deceive us. They didn't know. They were ignorant, and it was very passive, very unintentional. They're not trying to be charlatans. But it's like, it feels like once you've gotten past a certain point of your understanding, and this stuff, it's like that obligation to share it with people and to reflect on, what's actually happening here. And I've said before, when we look at Christianity, we're looking at stuff like, a blood magic death cult focused on scapegoating, shaped heavily by astrotheology and the Greco-Roman mystery cult context. But then you add in a couple more dynamics. You add in things like, Josephus or Paul, and you add in the Edessa story, and it's like people don't actually know what they're worshiping. They have no idea what they're worshiping.
No.
So,
and the real story, I think, is so much more interesting.
It is.
Than the original, fairy story with fairy dust on it. The fairy dust story, you've got this guy who's really not in control of his destiny whatsoever, But in the real story, you've got this commanding king who's got a real goal that, you know, they've been wronged by being thrown out of Parthia, and now they're going to take over the whole of the Roman Empire. Because remember, this guy was linked to all of the major empires of the known world. He was a son of Rome, of Egypt, of Parthia, and, you know, Syria, Judea. He was like the king of the whole world, if he could find a throne to go and sit on. And
Yeah.
that's what he didn't have. He didn't have a throne to sit on. But, you know, if he had managed to gather enough popular support, he could have unified the whole of Rome and Persia. It was a bold gambit, and it didn't pay off. But, you know, he was going for it. You know, it's a really interesting story.
Yeah, and we got Christianity as a result. That's
Yeah.
amazing. Well, I've got to just say, as we wrap up, I am overwhelmed, and I know that we're just touching the fringe of some of the stuff that you have studied and written about. But
Yes.
I would love to, if you're open to it, just kind of put in a place marker to say I'd like to pick up a book or two of yours, read through it, make my notes, and then to come back and follow up with some of the details and hopefully some better questions too, that some research I do of looking into it. But I also just want to say thank you for both for this time that you spent with me and my channel, but also thank you for just this research. I know that, you know, there's a lot of people that look at this stuff and they say, you know what, I can see through it, you know, whether it's philosophically or historically, I can see it's not real. And they walk away, but there's people that want to do the digging and want to do the research,
Yeah.
and they want to, I mean, I'm just assuming here, putting words in your mouth a little bit, but I'm assuming you just want to help people understand. And
Oh, absolutely.
I appreciate that so much, because that's on my
I've
heart
just
a
been
lot.
looking for the truth pretty much all the way through all of this and all of my life, because if people want to believe something, that's fine by me, no problem. But let's start from the foundations of truth, and then you can sort of work up from there.
Yes.
Let's not base it on any half truths or lies. And this is, as it were, the gospel truth. So it's a very strange middle road between the two belief systems that are out there at present. You've either got the literalists who believe everything, you know, in the entire Bible, not just the Gospels, is true, and then the mythicists who believes it's all mythical, because they can't find any of this in the historical records. That's not an unreasonable position to have if you can't find it in the historical record. Well, I've taken this middle road where I can show all of it in the historical record. And the beauty of that and the proof of that is that it makes more sense than the original story ever did. So if you get all of these characters, which were real historical characters, it makes sense, and it also becomes predictive. A lot of the things that I've said way back in the 90s and the early 2000s and so on has come true in later research. So I haven't had to go back into my previous books and amend them, because everything I said there actually turned out to be true from subsequent research. So
awesome.
I believe this is a true basis for this history, because it makes sense. I like to say it's either a crossword puzzle or it's a jigsaw puzzle. I think jigsaw puzzle is the best. If you've got a jigsaw puzzle and you're trying to force the pieces into position when they don't really want to go there, you're going to end up, you know, crumpling all the pieces, trying to force them in. I don't have to do that. All of my pieces just slot into the jigsaw, and the picture it portrays is a real picture of history. So the fact that all of these pieces just slot in so easily suggests to me that it's a true story. I don't know if you've got time for it, but one of the proofs of this was the Hyksos mosaic, which was only discovered like two years ago. And on my jacket of my cover of my Jesus King of Edessa book, I portrayed Jesus on the front there as an Edessan army commander and king, in Roman armor, with ginger hair, ginger beard, wearing stockings, because that's what they used to do in Parthia and so on. So I had this image on the front of my book. And then lo and behold, just a couple of years ago, they discovered and put out on National Geographic the Hyksos mosaic, which they said was an image of Alexander the Great. And it's exactly as I portrayed this guy on the front of my book.
Mm.
And I had to say to them, that ain't Alexander the Great. This is what I hate about modern academia and modern archaeology. They sold this story to National Geographic, obviously for a large sum of money. And National Geographic wanted a bold headline. They didn't want some strange person as the headline that you'd never heard of. And so they said it was Alexander the Great.
Hmm.
And I'm looking at this thinking, Alexander the Great wearing a payot, you know, a Jewish curly side lock of hair. Yeah, sure. Alexander always wore one of those, didn't he? Nothing to do with Alexander the Great. It's an image of Bar Kamsa. We were talking about Bar Kamsa before, which I had written about 10 years ago in my books. It's a very famous scene from the Talmud of Bar Kamsa giving a sacrificial calf to the high priest of Jerusalem in order to start the Jewish revolt, which is exactly what he did. And of course, Bar Kamsa is the leader of the Jewish revolt. And if you read the section on Bar Kamsa, it's exactly the same as the Gospels. And I give you the two quotes side by side. It's the same story exactly as you find in the Gospels, where Jesus goes to a party. You probably remember that story. This is the leader of the Jewish revolt. This is the Jesus character. And he's being in the Talmud, he's called Bar Kamsa. But of course, National Geographic didn't want discovery of Bar Kamsa. Who's that? You know, nobody has a clue of who Bar Kamsa is. But Bar Kamsa is Jesus, and the portrayal on this mosaic is exactly the same as I had on the front of my book when I had commissioned that picture. Oh, I don't know, 4 or 5 years before it was discovered. So here is my book and my thesis becoming predictive. It can predict what is going to be discovered in future archaeology, which I think is a good, good indication that it's on the right rungs.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you've certainly whetted my appetite. I'm definitely going to be picking up, these books and digging in, especially the ones about Jesus here to start with. But I'd love to eventually dig into the ones on Egypt and the Jewish origin story. But I just want to say again, thank you so much. Thank you for our chat. Thank you for what you've been doing. I appreciate this because you're helping people like me who want to know what happened. What was I in that I'm now out of? What was it that I was in? Because it's like once you're on the other side of it, I know some people walk away, but some of us really want to understand what happened. Yeah. And this is helpful. It's honestly a little bit healing too. I mean, not to switch it to psychology, but just to really be able to have answers. I mean, when we who were in it deconvert, we're very eager for answers, and sometimes the answers that we get are grossly insufficient, or they just don't add up. Answers like this help us to really start to move things forward, and I appreciate that a lot. And I think there's other people that are going to look at this and want to dig in deeper to your videos and your books, and I'm looking forward to taking it to the next level with you, hopefully in the next few months. But thank you again so much for doing this. I really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure.